Hey everybody, thanks for bearing with us with the little delay here. Had some internet troubles, but I think I got it fixed, so we should be all good to go. So thanks for joining us. Sorry it's been a bit of an issue, but still excited for this talk. It's a really interesting book. Learned quite a bit from it and lots of different stuff, and looking at Canada's involvement in Northwest Europe during the Second World War in a little different way. So I'm excited to have David Borys on today. So let's give him a warm welcome. Hey, David, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for agreeing to come on and all the problem we're having here.
Well,
Technology is amazing, but has its issues every now and again. So hopefully everyone can hear us okay. So we're going to start with a pretty much basic question of why this topic? I mean, within your book itself, you say it's not really talked about. It doesn't really get a place in the official histories. There's a little bit here and there from a few authors, but not much. In my own experience, I haven't really heard much other than cursory things. So I just kind of wondering why. Why?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as you know, and you've just went through the process. I mean, going back to my dissertation, it was about trying to find a topic that somehow posed, created something unique, right? As we do in our PhDs, we're trying to find something new to add to the historiography. And so the topic itself, originally I was really interested in urban combat. I really wanted to explore sort of how the Canadians fought in the urban space. And then my dissertation advisor at the time, Mark Milner at the University of New Brunswick, he thought it was interesting, but he had somehow stumbled on some civil affairs stuff in his own research, and he sort of threw this idea at me, and I didn't know anything about it, like most people, and I had to start doing some research, and I basically started researching it from the British perspective, because there had been some work done on British civil affairs, and the more I went into it, the more I realized this was a really, really important and yet totally untold story in Canadian history, Canadian military history specifically. And so I embraced that, and that became my dissertation. And then upon graduation, I began converting it into the book that came out just this year.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously I get that too, right? Just having coming through it all, like you said, and trying to find that different angle. I mean, yours is different. How you went about yours, finding kind of that difference. Sorry, I like to use the air quotes on this. It is definitely different because, and well, I'm sure we'll ask about this. I'll ask about this again later. But like I already said, coming at this topic in a different way. I mean, obviously, from those who know me and watch the channel and social media and stuff, I focus on the combat stuff with my family connection to Normandy and all that kind of thing. So seeing it from this angle really kind of opened my eyes. Like, I mean, I like to say this with other topics as well, but this is one of those things that is there. You understand it because these things have to happen, logistics and clearing, literally clearing rubble. Like that's why I picked the thumbnail photo, right? Because it's civilians and it's I think it's Con. I can't remember off the top.
Yeah, I think they look like Con.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a rubble-strewn street with civilians in it while they're trying to do work to get rid of that stuff.
Yeah.
So I mean, to me, that was just really at the heart of this. But again, it doesn't really come up in combat narratives, books, discussions, that kind of thing. So I just wonder if you could kind of give us a rundown for those who might be unaware of really what civil affairs is and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So civil affairs, Canadian civil affairs is rooted in a broader British civil affairs. So meaning that the Canadian Civil Affairs Organization was heavily influenced by previous British civil affairs, but British civil affairs is really rooted in imperial administration, frankly. It comes out of sort of the 20th century efforts to administer what was left of the British Empire. By the time they get to the Second World War, there is a body of literature within the British military on how to administer these sort of occupied or conquered or colonial territories, etc. And in the Second World War, there was a lot of fear and concern over what liberating areas of dense urban populations would look like. In 1940, when the Germans sort of steamrolled into France, that became a serious issue. These highly urbanized French cities, these streaming waves of refugees running from, fleeing from the Germans as they come in. And this created massive logistical issues. It created very serious operational issues. And after France fell and the British sort of, evacuated Dunkirk and all that, there was a lot of discussion about, we're going to be going back there, but how do we deal with these sort of very, very large population centers. And that was going to be a serious problem. And that concern, combined with the British imperial administrative experience, became the sort of nucleus for what would eventually be civil affairs. And civil affairs itself, even during the Second World War, went through a lot of hiccups. It went through a lot of problems in sort of the process to get to it. But effectively, civil affairs was by the time the Western Allies arrived in Northwest Europe, civil affairs was designed to sort of cope with these large urban civilian populations and to find a way, ultimately, to deal with the civilian populations in a method that prevented civilians from impeding military operations.
Right.
And that was the core of it all. This was all military based. One of the things I think a lot of people think is that civil affairs sort of sits in this silo of dealing with civilians, and that's it. And what we really have to understand is civil affairs is part and parcel of the larger military effort. It's about being able to successfully execute military operations without the fear or without the impediment of civilian populations getting in the way, either through demands for food, disease, refugee control, or what have you. Right. So this was the essence of civil affairs. And the Canadian Civil Affairs program, or the Canadian Civil Affairs branch, was very much part and parcel of this larger Anglo-Canadian civil affairs sort of development during this period.
Right. And then, yeah, you do a really good job, I think, in the book of explaining all this literally, because, again, like I said, anyone with experience or my level of experience or even less might have some trouble understanding this, because it took me a few times to kind of, just understand it. Right. Because, and like you said, it's they're learning. It's kind of new. And I do want to just kind of move through that. But I just wanted to say, like, you do a good job outlining that. And also kind of because I wrote things or I highlighted stuff that I like really stuck out to me. And when you wrote in the book, the intent here was not altruistic humanitarianism. Like, that really stuck out, because this isn't just done, out of the kindness of Allied leaders' hearts or anything like that. Like you said, it's literally part of the military operations. Yes, we want to, like, the ultimate goal is to essentially, again, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but get the civilians out of the way. There's these issues of disease, or don't want people clogging the roads, like you already said. And we'll talk about that, because I want to talk about kind of the different major areas that you talk about, your kind of case studies in the book, but just kind of the growing pains and everything. But that just really stuck with me.
And it's interesting, just to sort of interject there. What's interesting about that, and this is just maybe for anyone who's still doing their dissertation or still doing their research, at first when I started doing it, I really embraced the altruistic humanitarian narrative. I at first I was like, well, this is about, caring for civilians. And as the research unfolded, I had to really come to grips with the fact that actually that wasn't the case. This was about winning the war.
Right.
And I can remember some of my colleagues who reviewed it kind of said, I don't think this, my use of the term humanitarianism in previous drafts was just not backed up by the research. And I had to go through kind of a shift myself. So it's just interesting that you point that out, because even I was sort of rooted, I think a lot of us are rooted in, I don't want to call it a myth, but there's certainly this idea that, the Western Allies were there not just to win the war, but to help people, and certainly they were. And I'm not trying to take that away, but winning the war was the priority at all times. Beating the enemy on the battlefield, that was the priority. And sometimes, and we'll probably talk about it a bit, and sometimes that meant that certain things weren't done for civilians that maybe looking back now in the safety of our homes in a peaceful time, we think, well, that should have been done. But the battlefield, the ultimate goal was always to defeat the enemy on the battlefield, whatever that cost, whatever that meant in terms of the broader organizational challenges and objectives.
Right. And that makes sense. I think, you're saying that myth of the Western Allies, we're here to help. Obviously, that's the overarching goal is to win, but to help Western Europe overcome Nazism. Like that's straight up what's happening here. But there's also, how do you do that is not so clear in that sense of, right, it's not just we're all here for the humanitarian efforts.
That's
like
right.
You talk about the different areas, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to move it through case studies as you've organized the book. I think that's the best way. Oh, yeah, and sorry, I keep forgetting to mention, there's links to purchase the book below for Canada, the United States, and the UK. So check this out. It's a great book. It's definitely worth a read for sure. Everybody check that out in the description below. But so I wanted to talk about first, because Italy obviously is the first combat theater for the Canadian Army. Again, I know Hong Kong's first, but there's no, it's 2 weeks. There's none of this going on. But also Italy's very interesting because it's an enemy. It's the enemy, right there. Italy is still the enemy with the landings in Sicily. They don't surrender until a week after the main landing. The landings on the mainland. So it's an interesting case study of what they're having to deal with. And I keep seeing I mean, yes, it's civil affairs, but even again, in your book, you're explaining that this is still very much the growing pains here.
Yeah. Italy was the testing ground. It was very much where they were trying to apply. It was sort of where the vision of sort of what they might deal with would sort of unfold. And in Italy, they hadn't even coined the term civil affairs necessarily. They were using it. They were using it in documents, but the organization itself was called military government. And I think that refers, for instance, we do apply military government in Germany once we enter Germany. So this does refer to the fact that, this was an enemy population up until, of course, the events of the fall of the later 1943. And so Allied military government sort of imposes this civil affairs structure on Sicily and the mainland Italy. And there's very clearly immense amounts of problems. And I think, the chapter in the book goes through a number of them, disease spreads. There's very significant issues with separate jurisdictions applying different policies in different areas. There's a lot of problems with the way the combat forces operate and cooperate with the civil or the ANG forces, the military government personnel. There's a lot of issues regionally. It's a pretty frustrating period. It's a very, very, very steep learning curve. There are significant issues that are being dealt with, but and it's interesting because coming out of the Italian experience, a lot of of the military, a lot of the commanders operating or commanding combat troops are pretty soured towards the idea of military government. They're pretty soured towards this broader civil affairs structure, and that really is what spurs the name change. There's this sort of effort to discard the title of Allied military government or all these kind of things, and they sort of, in many ways, rebrand Allied military government as civil affairs. It's almost sort of like Vision 2 that gets deployed into Northwest Europe. And there is very much a hope that by sort of rebranding it, it'll sort of take on a new, it won't be so burdened with the issues that affected it in Italy. But it's very clear that the Italians' experience teaches a ton of really important lessons. And, when you look at the connection between Italy and then the arrival in Northwest Europe and France, you can see how a lot of those lessons were learned and applied. A lot of institutional changes were made. A lot of doctrinal changes were made. And the experience in France is much, much more effective and efficient than the experience in Italy. So as much as the Italian experience is sort of this very problematic period, and there's a lot of issues, and the chapter better explains it, but you can very clearly see that by the time they go to France and in June 44, a lot of these lessons have been discussed, learned. There's been a lot of changes and a lot of improvements to the organization, not just a name change as well.
Right. And to me, that was the striking part of all of this is I guess you kind of said it was like a rebranding effort, and not necessarily for the civilian benefit or anything like that. It's just like you said, the combat commanders are having issues with what's going on. I think one of the prevalent themes of the whole book is literally logistical support. You mentioned, they didn't have a car, or they had one car and 3 guys. It's just, and then they build up, but then they don't have the logistical support. They literally can't move in some instances, which is really, really interesting, because that seems to be a problem the entire time.
Yeah,
they have, when there's active combat operations.
Yeah, certainly.
But again, we'll get to because I do want to talk about the Netherlands quite a bit, because obviously there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
But that's a big one. So if we can move to France, because they're in Italy for a short period of time, because, as I understood it, there's no first Canadian Army. There's no that overall Canadian structure.
That's right.
Fighting in the Italian campaign. Yes, there's a corps there, but it's not the same thing.
Right.
So I wonder if you could just talk about very, very briefly kind of how that comes to be organized prior to D-Day, because I think that's important.
Yeah. So the Canadian government and the Canadian military establishment were all aware that this sort of civil affairs organization was expanding. From as early as 42, they knew that the British were sort of building up this sort of civil affairs pool of officers and this sort of personnel and this sort of environment. And the Canadians many Canadians wanted Canadian civil affairs officers with 1st Canadian Army.
Mm-hmm.
And the British were kind of under the impression that basically Canada would just funnel its civil affairs officers into the British civil affairs pool, from which then officers would be distributed as needed, throughout the Anglo-Canadian ranks.
Right.
But this is where a very interesting moment of sort of Canadian nationalism comes in, because the Canadian government sort of really resists this. And they kind of say to the British, look, like we want to create our own civil affairs pool, and this sort of back and forth occurs, and finally the British relent, and the Canadians start to create their own Canadian civil affairs organization. Now, obviously, it's under the umbrella of the larger Anglo-Canadian part of the war effort. It's under the umbrella of the larger Western Allies, but nonetheless, it becomes this sort of national civil affairs pool, this national civil affairs branch, and that then becomes fed into a 1st Canadian Army, because once 1st Canadian Army becomes operational in France, it thus, just like any other branch of 1st Canadian Army, civil affairs is thus officially sort of created. This Canadian civil affairs branch is thus officially formed. But there was very much this tension between, for a brief period, between London and Ottawa over this idea that they didn't just want to send Canadian soldiers over to Britain to be parceled out as the British saw fit. They were very concerned about that, and they wanted as much as possible Canadian civil affairs officers working with 1st Canadian Army.
Right. So it kind of fits the overall trend that's kind of going on in the war anyway, right?
So,
well, you can say this Canadian want, I mean, I'm sure it has more to do with King's government than anything,
sure,
of wanting to be independent. Again, that's not even the right word, because it's not true, but
yeah,
they're interlinked. Obviously, if that goes, you can see that with the RCAF, with the squadrons and all that, and then the bombing group, and then the Navy's a little different, but again, still integrated within, like you said, the overall Allied organization. But I just think it's interesting that, again, this lesser known area still follows that same theme. Right, and
which I think speaks to just these broader trends that are very clearly occurring. And like you say, independence is probably not, it's too strong of a word, but there is very clearly efforts by both the Canadian government and the Canadian military to define themselves independently of the British military effort and the British political effort.
Right, which is really interesting. So now, okay, so we'll get into like Normandy and the campaign. So their landing happens, they're still fighting inland. I think I can't remember the exact dates because I didn't write those down, but how quickly the civil affairs follows.
Within 24 hours, the first CA officers are on the beaches.
Right.
I think the earliest civil affairs officer comes across on the second wave, to be honest. So it's this is immediate. And just to contrast this for listeners and viewers, in Sicily, the civil affairs officers had to stow away on the boats. Yeah. So they didn't even they weren't even able to manifest, right? Exactly. But obviously we get to Normandy, and here they are, very clearly part of the landing force, and very clearly, meant to get there as quickly as possible and establish. So the civil affairs branch of basically be attached to 3rd Division first, and then 2 Corps, and then the broader 1st Canadian Army. I mean, they are landing almost as quickly as the frontline troops as the first sort of wave are arriving on the beaches. Which I find is really interesting. Like I was going to say that in my head it was the 7th, but I figured that was D-Day itself. I just couldn't remember the actual time. It might have been like the early morning of the 7th, but certainly within 24 hours of the meeting, right? Which is amazing, because I think, again, like I said earlier, that speaks to broader trends about the learning and what's going on. Like, these things are happening at the same time. We're talking about all the fighting going on inland and all that, how that's kind of still moving along, but it's becoming harder, or the Germans are, using that attritional element, but these guys are still landing. They're still thinking about these questions, which I think is very interesting, because it kind of shows not necessarily a confidence, but a learned sort of organizational, I don't want to say doctrine, I can't think of a better word at the moment, but you know what I mean? Like how they're going to go about doing this in France. Yeah. But there's 2 big things I want to talk about France. I think they're unavoidable, to me anyway. Is the first I want to talk about is Caen, the city itself, because I've already used your book because you gave me a good copy, and thank you for that, as a source for other stuff I've been doing. Okay. Like looking at Caen itself, right? Because there's, again, it's unavoidable, I think, the controversy that surrounds the bombing and everything. Yeah. And to me, it's really interesting, because you mentioned multiple times how difficult it was to operate in Caen.
not necessarily, well, because of, yes, the things that had been happening, but because the literal destruction of the city. And that gets talked about in other sources by other people and how that slows up the advance, that kind of thing. But you're talking about this at a deeper level. I don't know if that was your intention, but to me, when I'm saying that this book has this connection, it's talking about how difficult it is just to move around Con. So I wonder, I'm sorry, I don't want to steal your thunder here talking about it, but if you could talk about that part, right? Because that's just the thing that really stuck out in my mind was this case study within a case study, I guess you could say.
Yeah, case study within, absolutely. Yeah, case study within a case study. I think that's a great way to put it. Absolutely. Con is like day one of the classroom for civil affairs in Northwest Europe. And you know, as probably most of the viewers know, Con is thoroughly destroyed, primarily by Allied heavy bombers. And Canadian civil affairs officers are in Con the day it's liberated. The day, I shouldn't say that, the day it's liberated, but the minute Canadian soldiers are stepping into Con, the civil affairs officers are right behind them. And immense challenges arise. The city is thoroughly destroyed. It's a moonscape. There's no sewage, there's no running water, there's no medical facilities. It's just a complete disaster zone. And this task of dealing with this falls to civil affairs. And talk about having a major test on day one of your course, right? Like, this is a huge challenge for an organization that thankfully had the Italian experience to learn what not to do, and then to try to apply new lessons to civil affairs. And it wasn't smooth at times. It wasn't always perfect, but there was a lot of work being done. There was a lot of real good work being done by civil affairs officers to bring in medical supplies, to provide food, clean water, to get the sewage facilities up and running, to reestablish police law and order, because looting was a major problem. And, Canadian soldiers were complicit in that too. And there's a lot of issues with crime. There is still fighting going on the whole time. And that's, I think, really what I want to impress upon the person, people read the book, is that these guys are in the middle of artillery shells exploding. They're being shot at by snipers. There's fighting going on certain blocks. And many of these CAOs, civil affairs officers, are in the middle of that, trying to bring some sort of aid to a civilian population that, while not angry, is not happy with the situation either. They're frustrated with the fact that this fighting has resulted in the destruction of this ancient city, right? This city of William the Conqueror. This is a very important historical city that has been flattened. And now CA officers are the ones on the front lines of that sort of diplomatic aspect of having to sort of say, well, here's what we can do for you. Here's how we can help you right now. And it's a very, there's no time to waste. There's no time to, make mistakes. They have to really be working, the minute they step foot in the city, the job starts.
Yeah, that's kind of a perfect segue to what I want to talk about next. And maybe this isn't your favorite thing to talk about because he gets enough tension as it is, but it's unavoidable again, is the Gaulle and all the, just issues that come up with him. But I think that's very well known in historiography, documentaries, all that stuff. He's unavoidable. But for this, I think it's interesting because you hear about all these political fights that, de Gaulle wants this, Churchill wants that, they don't like each other, blah, blah, whatever. But what you talk about is what it actually looks like on the ground, like literally what's happening. Like, and these, the civil affairs officers are literally in the middle of what this looks like on the ground. And again, you hear about it. There's like, they mentioned de Gaulle lands, and he's there for a little bit and then he leaves. But like, you actually talk about what this means. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about that, more generally about what de Gaulle's trying to do and kind of.
It's a very
element of that.
Well, it's a very weird story because you have the sort of the meta narrative, right? You have these sort of the big political issues, de Gaulle, Churchill, all these people trying to sort out who is going to run France, who's going to be the leader. And you have the Allied leadership very worried that they don't want to go in and just impose a French political leadership on the French population. They're very, also they don't really like each other. Churchill and de Gaulle don't really like each other that much too. And that factors into it a little bit. But at the end of the day, the Allies they really don't want to be seen to be just being like the Germans and imposing another administration on these people. They really want the French people to choose. Now, the problem is there's not many real legitimate choices. And the other problem is de Gaulle has quite a bit of a sort of administrative structure already in place. What, he sort of has this sort of shadow government waiting to come in, and these sort of figures, these people, and I talk about a few of them, to go in and establish authority. And what ends up happening is you have the senior Allied leadership very, very reticent to condone or approve of or sort of acknowledge de Gaulle as the new leader of the French. But when it comes to the sharp end, when it comes to the civil affairs officers, the only guys they really can work with are Gaullists, they're de Gaulle's supporters. And so what you have is this very dynamic juxtaposition of, at the sharp end, civil affairs officers clearly working with de Gaulle supporters because they're the only guys who are kind of really there, trying to like get into place and sort of help get France on its feet again. And then you have the Allied leadership that is like, well, we're not officially sanctioning or condoning or approving of de Gaulle as the government. We want the French people to decide. But at the sharp end, that decision's kind of being made.
Yeah, and like that's why I wanted to talk about that, because to me, again, sometimes the English language really limits kind of all of our thoughts. But it's not a fait accompli, but kind of is. I mean, because you talk about this again through all the case studies, the idea of collaboration. And again, I'm not saying that's a black and white thing, because it isn't, not even close, especially in France, because there's the whole issue of Vichy. There's Vichy officials. I think I can't remember if they were all gone or they were suspected that some of them were still there. That's what I mean. Even reading the book, this is still, and I'm not blaming you by any means, because it's just French politics and France during the war is very complicated.
It's very complicated. And I didn't want to wade into it too deeply in my book. That would have been a whole other story.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you, because it can be it's a hot button issue in France. It can be a hot button issue in Canada. I've gotten in trouble for it a little bit, but anyway, dissertation fun. But it's just really interesting, right? Because it like you said, it's the shadow administration. De Gaulle's thought this through. He thought this through. Understands what it's gonna look like on the ground. I mean, I don't want to give him kudos, but he really thought about what this was going to look like, and that's really interesting, because in comparison to Belgium, which you talk about as well within depth, and if you can talk about that in a second, that'd be great. But it's just such a contrast to what's going on. And I wonder if you could just talk about what's going on with Belgium. So as we're just kind of moving through chronologically here now, because they land in France, there's the Battle of Normandy, and then Falaise Pocket and all that stuff. And then kind of the long left flank, as it's called, moving through the Channel ports. And there's issues there as well. But I wanted to kind of keep moving because we were already late, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. But then moving into Belgium, it seemingly is a whole other ball game, to use a sports analogy.
Belgium is interesting in comparison to France because there's a very clear government in exile, and a government that is supported by the Allied leadership, but it's been in exile, just like, no different from de Gaulle per se, even though he wasn't an official in any way recognized as the official sort of government of France. This is, Hubert Pirlo. This is a very set up, administration. The administration flees Belgium. The Allied leadership, provides protection. They're in Great Britain. And when Belgium's liberated, in comes this, government in exile that has been gone for 4 years almost, right?
Yeah,
4 years, and so you have all of a sudden the Allies showing up in Belgium and saying, okay, we brought back your government. This is who we recognize. But meanwhile, in those 4 years, you have these very, very well organized, quite large, and at times not friendly resistance groups that are all operating within the country, who all expect a place in the new liberated Belgium. Well, the Allies at first were saying, well, no, it's up to the Belgian government that we recognize, to decide who gets a place in the government. And this creates very significant tension. There's a lot of problems with resistance groups who really feel that this Belgian government in exile, frankly, is illegitimate because it's been on for so long. And there's a lot of very serious, real concerns about resistance groups causing significant problems within this newly liberated Belgium. And the civil affairs, the Canadian civil affairs plays a very significant role in I wouldn't say mollifying, but in straightly telling these resistance groups, if you do not cooperate with this government, you will be thus considered, for lack of a better term, an enemy of the Allied movement. Like, this is the government we recognize. If you resist this government, you are effectively resisting the word of the Allied leadership. And, in no uncertain terms, there's some, anecdotes in the book that show you where these civil affairs officers go in and say, this is the law. And if you don't want to follow it, well, this will be a problem. You will find this a problem with the Allies themselves.
Right. And yeah, like you said, the anecdotes, I think the mentioning of Ypres is interesting because that's one of them, right? Because that has all the connections and everything to the First World War.
That's right.
No one's really thinking about it. What what the administration's like, what's the fighting or what the resistance groups did. And again, I know this doesn't necessarily need to be said, but again, these resistance groups are armed to the teeth.
Yeah.
Like they are, in some cases, as you mentioned, better armed than the new Belgian government.
Yeah, 100%.
Which is something that can't be ignored, right? Because you mentioned some very, very tense, you write it across as this kind of tension. Frankly, outright tension, where it could turn to violence with what's going on here. Because, like you said, they want to fight for a place in the new Belgian government. They want the country to look like. I mean, and you mentioned too that the Belgian army. And sorry, this is something I forgot to mention too. Is you do in a very good way keep bringing it up that these countries are expected by the Allied powers to contribute to the war. They're not just liberated and they're done. That's not what's expected of them. And I think Belgium is an interesting case of that because, like you just said, and we were talking about now, is these armed groups. They're trying to get a Belgian army back, and also trying to arm police, which is something that you mentioned as a difficulty. Like they literally can get people, but they're not armed, and there's nothing they can do in certain cases because the resistance is better armed.
Yes, and that you can imagine the complications of this. You're trying to go to these well-established groups, fully armed, who have resisted, Nazi occupation for years, and now you're telling them, "All right, guys, back down. We're in charge now, and maybe you have a place in this new government, or maybe you don't. Maybe you have a place in the new military, or maybe you don't. We'll have to let this government in exile, who's now arrived, make the decision." And you can imagine resistance groups having a very, very big problem with that. Not only that, you have the ideologies. You have some ideological differences. So you, of course, have communist-backed resistance groups who have their own sort of vision for liberated Belgium. And then at the same time, and this tension is a big part, you have this country that seems to be sort of slow to get into the war effort. They sort of get liberated, and it very much, certainly from the Canadian perspective, there is this feeling that the Belgians are kind of dragging their feet a little bit in terms of getting themselves geared up to fight the war in the way that the Allies expect every liberated country to fight. And I think I'm glad you made that point, because this is really important. This is not like we'll liberate you and on we go with the fighting. It's like we'll liberate you, and now we need your people to help us continue liberating the rest of Northwest Europe.
Right, which is again, I think it's one of those things that you think about, but not maybe deeply when you're thinking about this, because we talk about all the big operations and all the big armies, the British and the First Canadian Army and the British Second Army and all the U.S. armies that are basically pushing their way towards the German and the Dutch border after pushing through the Belgium, and you don't really think about is Belgium going to have a part in this now, what are the French going to do now, right? Because there's obviously the French divisions that help liberate France are very well known, but it's not really thought about again until later, kind of where they're pushing into Germany, because you have the whole Market Garden thing, which we're going to have to talk about because we can't not. And then, of course, the Bulge, and then how that all develops, and the strategies change and that kind of thing. But that kind of mentioning of Market Garden, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of the people watching do know that it was not going to talk about the Monty stuff, but the attempt to kind of end the war quickly. It didn't work. The Dutch population tried to help the Allies. They went on strike, like all the railroad workers went on strike. So the Germans, in retaliation, cut off food. And it's well talked about in other things, and I've seen amazing podcasts and books and all that, talking about the hunger winter and all that. And I think this is why your book's so great for the historiography element of all of this, is it brings in that new part. Again, we hear all kinds of stories. Like, I was watching a movie the other day with my fiance with Audrey Hepburn in it. Like, she gets talked about, sometimes she gets a anecdote and stories about, she survived the hunger winter, that kind of thing.
Right.
But you talk about the details. So I was wondering if you could, like you did kind of for Belgium, talk about what that looks like once the First Canadian Army is involved in the Netherlands.
Yeah, so it's an incredible story, and I would certainly say this is one of the more popular um, narratives of the Second World War. Certainly, I think when people think of Canada in the Second World War, I would argue that the Netherlands is probably up there in terms of people. If there's something that Canadians remember of the Second World War, it's probably one. The Netherlands is certainly D-Day, DAP, Netherlands. And I don't want to get into the debate of the most important things, but anyways, we know that this is a very, very important narrative that's echoed down the ages.
Right.
And I just in my chapter, I just really, I had, and I'm sure you've gone through the same experience. When I was going through my schooling, and especially when I was deep in the historiography during my PhD, you'd hear about Canadian soldiers would, some Canadian soldier would give a chocolate bar to a kid, or they'd share their rations with a family, or who they were billeted with, and you heard these kind of informal anecdotes, but then at the same time you'd hear, well, but Canada also helped, with this sort of starvation crisis, but there was never the connection of the two wasn't, because there was no, I kept thinking, it was like, there was no way that they were just informally helping feed them, because that just wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have been effective. Right. And so what I really wanted to do in this chapter is to try as much as possible to really show you how that actually occurred. Like, what did the Canadians do? How did they plan it? How much stuff was going on? How many days? What did the convoy look like for Operation Faust? And all of these kind of things. I just really wanted to, as much as possible, show the ways in which Canadian civil affairs were actively leading, organizing, and implementing this sort of feeding mission, this relief mission, and there was no question that by the winter of 44-45, tens of thousands of Dutch were close, very, very close, scarily close to acute starvation, and had this dragged on, had the German sort of, for lack of a better word, the blockade of food for the Dutch people, had this continued, there were some very serious concerns about mass starvation. Now, the Canadians themselves at first were struggling with, do we feed them, or do we fight the Germans, right? And this is the big problem. This is where that tension in civil affairs comes out again. Is the best thing for the Dutch people to liberate them through military victory over the Nazis, or is the best thing to do is to try to negotiate some sort of truce and thus bring them food? And this is the one time in the Netherlands where the military priority is made second to the humanitarian priority. And I think that is what makes the Netherlands so interesting. And perhaps that's why the whole Dutch experience, the Dutch liberation experience, is so important for Canada in the years and decades that have followed, is that maybe this one time we can claim that there was humanitarian principles that trumped the military objectives.
Right. And that's the one thing I did want to talk about with the Netherlands, is, like I said at the beginning, it's not altruism that they're doing this.
Right.
But in this case, they know the crisis is so bad, because they're in talks with the Germans, and they have obviously intel coming across the lines, but they know how bad it is. So yeah, like you just said, they're not. What option do we take? Do we fight, or do we shoot our way in, or do we negotiate our way in to bring?
That's right.
And that's a very well known part of the story. But like you said, the nuts and bolts aren't so well known. I mean, before I read your book, I think I did something on this my first year running all the Twitter stuff, and it was kind of hard to kind of get the nuts and bolts of it, what that looked like. Yeah. I mean, like, there's famous photos, and they're like, oh, they signed this and they negotiated here, and there's a photo of these two guys at the back of a truck. Like, what does that mean? Like, that doesn't tell me anything.
That's right. That's right. And that's the point. And there's a lot more work to be done. And I don't want the viewers to think that, like, my book is not an official history of civil affairs. It's not, it's not meant to be, it was meant to be a sort of readable, chronological exploration of the key challenges in these countries that civil affairs and then military government face. So there's a lot more to be said on the issue. I don't speak Dutch. I don't read Dutch. So there's a lot more sources that are out there. And for any upcoming students, a definitive book on the relief of the Dutch by the Canadians would be an incredible contribution to historiography. But you need to get into the Dutch archives, and you need to start looking at Dutch sources.
Oh, that'd be huge. I mean, it would be massive to look at this in this way, because again, like you said, it's got this mythology around it and misunderstandings, and sometimes there's that warm fuzzy feeling, and a lot of times there wasn't a lot of warm fuzzy feelings from the Dutch. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they're like, yeah, there's parts of this that we were not so happy about, and had lived through it. So I mean, it needs this this re-examination, basically, and I think your book opens that up in a way.
That's good. I'm glad you did. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll praise your book and until people tell me to shut up, but it is that good. Like it is just that good. I don't say these things just to say these things. Like, I mean, I've been doing this for how many years now, and it's just a new way of looking at it. It's a different way. I mean, I want to talk about one thing quick because this story again stuck out to me, and I really hope I pronounced this correctly. But the island, I think it's one of the skinny islands in the river that formed the front line for quite some months. Betua, I think I said that right.
Yeah.
That story is really interesting to me because I think it's one of the success stories. You talk about how they get, 25,000 people out.
Yeah.
But to me, what really stuck out is not just the people, because that had happened in other places. Obviously, there's always civilian casualties.
Yep.
But the livestock,
yeah,
that to me is huge. Like, was it 98%?
Yeah. And so I mean that, and you got to think to yourself, imagine these Canadians just using amphibious vehicles to remove livestock from an island. I mean, I'm sure Canadian soldiers were like, this was not the war I expected to be. But it just shows. I think it shows you though, the way in which by this point in the war, civil affairs was such an efficient function branch, because it was. These guys were smart enough to go into these places and say, all right, what are the concerns here? And the people say, they would speak to a spearhead civil affairs officer and they'd be like, look, well, obviously my family, we're worried about this, we're worried about that, and the livestock. And here these civil affairs officers then went back and they planned these operations. And it was, it's phenomenal how by the time they get to the Netherlands, how well functioning this branch was. And that example is sort of one of those I purposely wanted to put in there to show you, like, look how good these guys are at their job by now, not just people, but livestock, like doing everything they can to try to mitigate the damages of war. But at the same time, still people and the livestock in the way can be very problematic as well. So it's that balance that's always going on, right?
Well, yeah, that's why it really stuck out to me, because I've done quite a bit of research more recently over the last year or so of the Nijmegen salient and how crammed that area was. Like, it's just absolutely crammed, especially when they're starting to plan for Operation Veritable. Like, I mean, it's literally like they're running out of space.
Yeah.
And then to read something like this, I mean, this is months before that, but it's still part and parcel of all of this is that they're going to get all these people out fairly easily, not easily, but like, well, I don't know, efficiently, I guess is the best way to say it. But then dedicating these resources and listening to the people, because livestock, I mean, in today's modern West, we don't like, a lot of us are not farmers anymore. We don't think about that and how important that is to people. Like, having those cows is huge, like, or pigs or whatever, like that's your livelihood. And we've talked about food and how important that was, particularly in the Netherlands. So that's why, again, and to anybody watching, David didn't tell me to talk about any of this stuff. I picked these out by myself. Like, he didn't tell me really anything. He just said, enjoy the book. So like, that's just kind of where I was thinking with this, because I kind of, when I went in reading it, like I've already said, I wanted to keep the combat stuff in mind, because that's what David had said is important here, is that's what the civil affairs is doing. So that's just constantly kind of what was turning in my head reading about these issues. And this one really stuck out to me because it's moving people, and in an area of Canada's war, which gets attention. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but like we were just previously speaking about, the Netherlands liberation gets a lot of the focus. And this is before that time, right, when we're all focusing on things like Operation Manna, Chowhound, and all that, and moving through the cities and the celebrations and everything. Nijmegen doesn't really have a lot of that after Market Garden because of how poorly everything went. Sorry. So it's just really, to me, that's sticking out. So, and the last one kind of connects us back to the first one, when they move into Germany.
Yeah.
Because things literally change again. Names literally change. So if you want to just touch on that would be awesome.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. And it was funny because when I was doing the research, I was kind of shocked I thought I was missing something. And then I realized I wasn't. The minute the civil affairs officers moved across into Germany, they now became military government. And in fact, the senior civil affairs leaderships at different points throughout the military occupation of Germany and the sort of what is called the friendly occupation of the Netherlands, for lack of a better term, you would have civil affairs officers who were both CA and MG leadership. So they were kind of like, it was this weird transition period, and it was very confusing for me because I just said it couldn't be as simple as you just move into Germany and you're suddenly military government, but it was. And when civil affairs moves into Germany, the Canadians occupy a portion of northwest Germany. And in that area, they impose a Canadian military government. And it's really interesting because it kind of brings full circle. In Italy, it was Allied military government where there was no actual specific Canadian formation. And here we are in Germany in 45, and we have now a Canadian military government formation. And they effectively occupy the area. And as the chapter explores, there is a lot. It's a very dark period for obvious reasons. There's a lot of complexities to the situation. Something like denazification. So that's a very, very complex issue that the Civil Affairs takes the lead on, trying to find local, prominent Nazi leaders. At the same time, law and order is a very, very, very a serious issue, primarily because so many displaced persons, particularly, labor, forced labor conscripts or forced labor slaves, if you even want to use that term, which I think is actually not inaccurate. Russians, Eastern Europeans, they're suddenly free. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of anger, of course, and there is a lot of revenge, and there is a lot of violence. Mm-hmm. And it's dark, and the Canadians it's very complicated for Canadians. Some Canadian soldiers fully understand why these Eastern European displaced persons are taking revenge on the population, and some Canadian soldiers just step back and let it happen, and others not so much. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that effectively not, and just to clarify, I only look at the 3-week period that official military government existed. After that 3-week period, it becomes the Canadian Army Occupation Force. That's another book for another time. But in this 3-week period, it's interesting because the German people look to the Canadians for protection. And that is weird to think about.
Yep.
And it's a tumultuous period. And I think the Canadians do a fairly good job. They're in there for a short period, but there's a lot of bigger issues at play that 3 weeks as military government will just simply not solve. And in the future, if I can get to it, I hope to do a book on the occupation force and sort of be the sequel to the Civil Affairs story.
Yeah, because that part sticks out obviously because it's coming to the end of the war. Like you said, there's these, again, the stories that you include are quite shocking, to be honest. I mean, I had heard of all this stuff before, but not to that detail, which is horrifying to read, but it is important to read. Like, these things happen. These things occurred. We have to understand what happened, what they were dealing with, the civil affairs, and kind of what that looked like. Because again, you do a very good job talking about these complicated problems that happen, all these different groups, like literally moving people place to place, like talking about like literally moving people either, west or east, like that's literally going on, which I think is, again, it's so simple that it just makes sense.
Yeah.
What's going on. And because again, the displaced persons, the slave labor that's going on, all that stuff. And it's important to read. But again, it's such a short period. So it's kind of hard to kind of dig in because the stuff with the Belgians goes on for a long time.
Yeah.
The Netherlands is an extended period, as we all know, based on how the war develops. But then once they cross the Rhine and get into Germany, things go quite quickly, relatively speaking.
Yeah, so it's worth pointing out. It's worth pointing out just for the viewers, like military. What makes military government is the fact that they are not cooperating with civilian leadership at this point. There's no effort to sort of. There will be in the future to bring up a German administration that's friendly to the West, of course. But in these 3 weeks, this is Allied law. So the senior Canadian officer in Germany is the boss. He's the military governor in every sense. And there's a lot of this is, it's very interesting because we think of Canadians as sort of very peaceable liberation, this sort of story. And then it changes dramatically when they go into Germany. And the narrative of this sort of friendly army, helping liberate people suddenly becomes a very real military government enforcing very strict rules over a beaten, conquered population. And many Canadian soldiers who go into both civil affairs and not in civil affairs go into Germany looking at these people as an enemy who has, supported this horrific tyrannical government that has brought a war to the world. And you can imagine the anger, you can imagine the lack of sympathy and the lack of empathy for many of these German civilians that these Canadian soldiers have. And it's a complicated, it's a dark period. And it's interesting, just to kind of touch on that, when I had people reading the drafts, I had a lot of feedback, but a lot of negative feedback over some of the stories that I included in there. And while I can understand it making everyone uncomfortable, it was not comfortable to write about. I believed very, very, very strongly that it had to be shown. You had to be uncomfortable with what was going on to understand the complexities that civil affairs or military government faced in this region. And if these anecdotes don't get told, then it again goes back to the liberation story, goes back to these stories. We just have never really gotten to the nuts and bolts of a lot of this. And it's very important that we understand that there's, good moments and very dark moments as well within the Canadian experience.
Right. I mean, other people have been saying this particularly lately, but if sometimes that the history is not making you uncomfortable, it's not being done properly.
Yeah.
And I think this is a perfect example of that. Because again, there's all kinds of books and everything about the Dutch liberation and, tons of pictures. And then people are like, yeah, they went into Germany, but what does that even mean? Like, we don't know. There's no photos of this stuff. I literally tried to find, I did some work for an organization trying to do this, trying to literally understand like what it looked like in the Netherlands, like pictures and representations, what have you. And then it looks like in Germany, and the German, is it's like a ghost town. I couldn't find hardly anything about what that even literally looked like on film. So I think that speaks to a lot. And I mean, sorry, this is a bit off topic, but it's connected, is Band of Brothers, which I think just had its 20th anniversary a couple days ago or last week or whatever, has an episode, right, where the 101st is now an occupation force, and what that looks like. There's all kinds of violence, looting, drinking, and the Canadian story is no different. For troops on the ground. And that's not even just in Germany. I mean, you didn't really talk about this per se, but and maybe this might be a good place to finish. But like you said, it's only the military government for 3 weeks, and then it becomes the occupation force.
Right.
The Dutch were kind of getting tired of the Canadian troops. Like, thanks, but go home.
Yep.
And again, I don't know, you didn't really talk about that per se, but I was wondering if you had any like thoughts on that, or kind of what came across in your own research for that.
Well, it's interesting because military government in Germany wraps up within 3 weeks, and this Canadian Army occupation force takes over. And what's interesting is when the CAOF takes over in Germany, civil affairs continues operating in the Netherlands. So in fact, the civil affairs is the mission that goes the longest in terms of the after the war is over is in the Netherlands. And by this point, and I used the term friendly occupation earlier on, and I kind of use that ironically because it's hard to kind of explain what the Canadians were in the Netherlands for so long that for many Dutch felt by the end of the war, and certainly in the weeks after the end of the war, that, okay, thank you for the liberation, but I think it's time that you should go. And for many Dutch, the Canadians had worn out their welcome, not because necessarily the Canadians were bad at what they were doing. And actually, they weren't bad at what they were doing, but it's just that so many young men, such a big military institution, these men are armed. They are clearly the authority in the country, despite the fact that there is now a Dutch administration and there's a Dutch political apparatus, and the Dutch are sort of righting themselves, or they're sort of now starting to get back to sort of before the occupation. But while the Canadian military is there, the Canadian military is clearly the power that be, and the longer the Canadians are there, the increasing amount of tension exists, and it becomes at times, fairly clear and fairly apparent that the Dutch have, thank you, but we think it's time that you leave and let us go about our own way. And why that becomes important, and I touch on some of the tension in the chapter, but we kind of move on to Germany. But why that is important is just because the Canadian experience in Northwest Europe is not just this do-gooder. It's not just this clean narrative. It's not a narrative of good kids, liberating and doing good things all the time. It's a lot more gray than the narrative has often presented it. Certainly outside of the military history community, the narrative is this sort of the good guys winning, the good guys always being good, and that's the end of the war, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's not the case, because of course most Canadian soldiers were extremely well behaved and were extremely respectful of the populations they encountered, but it's just simply not that clean. And hopefully when you finish the book, not only do you learn about civil affairs and military government, but you also get a bit more nuance for the Canadian war experience in Northwest Europe, all the way through into Germany.
Yeah, and then that's kind of was my big takeaway. I mean, obviously I know that there's all kinds of gray and all of this stuff, but to understand what it actually looks like in this theater that I would say gets the most attention, Canadian attention,
Yeah.
is important because, like you said, it's not just do-gooders doing good things. It's complicated. They're humans, first of all. They're young humans who are armed and have access to all kinds of stuff, and it causes issues. And I mean, civil affairs tries to limit that as best they can, but it's difficult. Like we already talked about, kind of the Belgian example, lack of police. Who is the police? Who has the authority to even arrest people?
Exactly.
It's something you talk about, and that is an issue because of what I just said. Young people with guns who are sometimes drunk, and things happen. So it's an interesting way of adding another layer to a theater that we understand, but I still argue we don't even understand things like Normandy very well. There's just so much going on, and this is just another layer that I think is going to help us understand. Because again, I can't keep getting this image that we're talking about, the Canadian, advance across is just literally that line that gets drawn on a map, and that makes it look so clean and easy, and it's not.
And I think a lot of Canadians really love to embrace the idea that it's clean and easy too, right? There's no doubt that we have wrapped up in our vision of what it means to be Canadian, our identity, our history, and we're faced with very serious challenges to a lot of that clean identity. I mean, this is off topic, but it's connected in a broader sense. Our discoveries at residential schools, right? These recoveries, not discoveries, as they're saying, and of these mass graves. And I think Canadians are very uncomfortable when we are suddenly faced with the idea that were we always good, or you mean we've made mistakes? I think people are uncomfortable with that in this country for some reason, and not that. And again, I just want to drive this home. In no way am I trying to say that the Canadians were the bad guys in Northwest Europe, or
not even close.
Yeah, not even close. But we certainly there are times when it was a lot darker and a lot more complicated in terms of behavior and choices being made by soldiers. And there was efforts and civil affairs is dealing with this all the time. Yep. In reading the book, you're just faced with a bit more of a challenge. This idea that all we were good guys, always doing good things.
Yeah, and that's I think that's a good point to kind of end on talking about the book is that exactly. It adds nuance to more things than you think. That is the big thing that came across to me, like I already said, thinking about it, combat first, it adds layers to that, and then occupation, all the different titles that are used, all that different stuff. It can get complicated. Your book does a good job of laying it out because I understood it so much better than other books because it's kind of just that, that epilogue part. They're like, yeah, occupation, okay, war's over. Book's over, that kind of thing. You take it that next step, and that's important because we need to understand what this is like. Because I do believe history has value in learning what to not do or do next. So I think you do a good job of that. So, so again, the links to the book are in the description. Please check it out. It's a good book. It's worth a read. It's great. It only took me a long time to get through it because I was doing a dissertation at the exact same time. Please don't let that reflect on the book. Because I think I talked about this a long time ago, and this is just happening now. But that's nothing to do with David Orr's book. That's all on me.
Thank you, Brad. You're very kind, and you're kind.
Yeah, so
I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. It's my pleasure to have you on and to talk about this. So there's a link to David has a podcast that is also great. There's a link down in the description for that. It's not just military history. It's all kinds of different stuff. I haven't been able to keep up with it lately because, again, I'm so busy. But there's some very different cool topics on there that I've got to listen to a while back. So check it out. There's all kinds of different stuff. So one last question I did want to ask, because I do like to ask this to most people, is kind of, you already touched on it, but like, what's next? Do you have a next step for this? Is there plans to move forward with this, the things you talked about? Are you going a completely different direction?
Yeah, I think, so my goal is at some point to write the book on the Canadian Army Occupation Force. I think that's a few years off. Right now, I'm just completing the first draft of actually a new book about Canadian military history since 1867. So I'm going to basically write a survey. I basically wrote a survey book, much like Desmond Morton's sort of classic, sort of a 21st century version of that. And so I've signed, I can't speak too much about it, but I've signed a publishing agreement for that book. And just wrapped up the first draft, and so hopefully that book will come out. It'll be called Canada at War, and hopefully it will come out within the year.
Oh, awesome! That's great. I mean, that's keep saying this, but that's another I think hole is that needs to be filled. Yeah, Desmond Morton's work is great, but it was just written so long ago
Yeah,
that there's been some changes and even just new evidence. So I think that's great. Yeah, so hopefully you can come back on and talk about that one, because
love to.
that would I'm sure would be another
Good discussion.
a good discussion and what's going on with that, and then we can talk about what's going on next. So I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody, and I'll check in with you in a second.
Okay.
So thanks everyone for watching. Sorry about the technical glitch part. It kind of literally happened last minute. But thanks for everyone for watching now and in the future. If you like what I do, please support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee. The links are down below. Also, if you do buy the books through the link, full and open disclosure, I get a little commission from that I also help keep doing all this stuff, because I can't do this without you. So please remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video, and comment below kind of what do you want to see next. Is there some author? Is there an author out there you want me to try and talk to? Is there a topic you want me to touch on? Please leave your thoughts, because I'd like to hear everyone's kind of understanding with that. So thanks again for watching. So David, did you enjoy being on the show?
Absolutely. That was fantastic.
Awesome. That's great. So thanks everyone for watching again. This is Brad from On This Day in Canadian Military History. So I'll see you on the next live stream.